Well, hello and welcome to our devotion time. We're back with Abraham this week, or Abram as he's called right now. And we're going to read a little bit of chapter 13 and then maybe catch up with Abram since we left him over a week ago and be reminded of some of the stories we read before then. So let me read just a little bit of chapter 13 in Genesis here. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife, and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, silver and gold, and he went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place on the altar which he had made there previously. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So today we're going to discover that the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament. And the God of the Old Testament speaks about grace quite a bit as well as in the New Testament. I know sometimes you will encounter brothers and sisters that will look at the Old Testament and say this is a testament that talks about God being a judge and a prosecutor and those notions there. And obviously we saw some of that with our study in Isaiah, those who read along with that. Yep, he is a judge, but he's also full of grace. And if you remember in our study of Isaiah, the first part was judgment, and the last third was about grace. And so we're going to see that here in Abram's story as well. And let's think about this. The past couple weeks we've been talking about Abram, and here at the end, as he looks over the promised land, if you remember, our story took us to Egypt. He traveled to Egypt. And Abram really blew it there. So the last time he blew it, and actually blew it 3 times. And what I'm talking about there, if you think about it, is that we'll just talk about these three times. But in the midst of him blowing it 3 times, he was in this bubble of grace that God was giving him in that. And so, what am I talking about when I say he blew it? Well, first, think about this. He did not fully follow the Lord's instructions to go out from his father's family. He took his nephew Lot, his brother's son, with him, and I guess we could say that's in a direct disobedience of God, because God said, "Go out of your family." He took Lot with him, which was a part of his family. Second, when the times got tough in the land that the Lord was showing Abram, he bailed out and he ran off to Egypt, where God never told him to go. And third, once he got to Egypt, he was not only dishonest, but he was also completely dishonoring of his wife Sarah. He endangered her purity. He subjected her to the depraved lust of the Pharaoh and his harem attendants. And so that's huge. And so, okay, that means, when we look at these terrible things that he did, at least this last one was incredibly terrible. We might can finagle and say, it was okay for Lot to go with him, but this last one we sure can't make any excuses there. And so what do we do if we're in the Old Testament? That means God's a God of judge. There's no grace around. And so that would mean God should pull the plug, right? And since he's disobeyed, he's under the law. Therefore, in his disobedience, he's now under the curse of the law. And I guess we could say 3 strikes, you're out. Isn't that the way it works in just a purely legalistic system? Well, surely God could find someone else more spiritual than Abram. But surprise, grace is not just a New Testament concept. The God of the Old Testament is just as much a God of grace as we find in the New Testament. in the Hebrew mindset, when we're dealing with these terms, law and grace, um, they're important, but not as important as the one who founded the law and grace, if you can follow me there. The issue, a lot of times, Western civilization, Western theology, we just look at law and grace, which are, again, is incredibly important, but sometimes we ignore the giver of law and grace. And the Hebrews culture, I don't see them leaving that out or missing that point. And so I want us to, I guess, enter this passage with a Hebrew, or Old Testament mindset here when it's first being established. And so, contrary to Christian teachings that attribute grace to just New Testament, is actually in the Old Testament. And when we say look at grace and define grace, our English Bibles, if you run across some definitions in the back, it's unmerited favor is usually what it's called. And it's much more in a Hebraic mindset, and that's not bad. Unmerited favor is a great notion there. But let me fill in a little bit more understanding with the Hebraic thought of grace. It's a picture grace as a way of communicating God's faithfulness, not so much what we receive, but look at it in terms of Hebrew people looked at it in terms of the faithfulness of God, and they kind of left themselves out of the picture in some sense. And so when they think of God's grace and God's laws, His promises, they think of Him. He's not going to abandon. He's not going to revoke His promises, nor is anyone to whom He made those promises or extended those promises going to lose that privilege that He's promised. No matter how many strikes they get, no matter how many strikes we have against us, the promises are still ours to grab hold of. That's kind of the Hebrew mindset. And that's not because of our merit. It's solely because of His faithfulness. That's the Old Testament view of grace. Grace is totally based on in God's faithfulness. And actually, if you really study and look at and pay attention, that's exactly what the New Testament's saying as well. This grace, unmerited favor, it's completely based on God's faithfulness to us and to His commitments. The Lord's type of grace is not a mushy, sentimental pity or soft-heartedness. His grace is not a Santa Claus type grace. His type of grace involves a fierce loyalty to His promises. And hear me say that, to His promises, to what His words speak. He's fiercely loyal to the words that come out of His mouth. He does not turn away from that. And so if He's made a promise to us, like we've celebrated here at Easter, the cross is our promise, He's going to make sure that it's carried through. In the Old Testament, the promises that were given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it was a generational promise. It didn't just stop with them. It kept going and actually gets us. He is determined to protect His honor. God is determined to protect His honor. His grace is rooted and grounded, as Paul would say, in this steely determination that says whatever it takes to keep a relationship on course, that's what I'll do. Whatever it costs, that's what I'll spend. And so sometimes the Lord's grace takes the form of forgiveness, because that's what's necessary to keep the relationship on course. Other times, however, His grace takes the form of strict discipline, because under certain circumstances, that's what's necessary to keep a relationship on course. And in the same way, sometimes the Lord's grace takes the form of direct supernatural intervention on our behalf. And because that's what it takes to keep the relationship on course. Other times, however, His grace takes this frightening form of hiding His face from us, and it appears that He's aloof, that He's nowhere to be found, He's not approachable, uh, and we may be seeking, but it seems like He's disappeared. But He does this because under these circumstances, that's what it takes to keep the relationship and His dream for our lives on course. The Lord's grace is the means by which He ensures that His word will not return void. It will, His word, He has determined that His word will accomplish its assigned task. His grace is not an outgrowth of His niceness. It's an outgrowth instead of His fierceness, His power, and His unshakable dedication to see His covenant commitments through to the very end. Well, there's some food for thought for today as we continue on in our study of Abram. And again, we began looking at the beginning of Genesis chapter 13. But I would suggest as you ponder some of the things I've talked about today, maybe go back to chapter 12 and look at the failures and see how even in the midst of Abram blowing it, he receives God's grace. And what a great promise for us. How many times have we blown it? And I know it's been more than three. And so it's good to hear it's not 3 strikes and you're out, but it's by God's grace, and He's fiercely protecting this covenant promise that He's made with us. And praise God for that. Well, you have a great day, and I will see you Wednesday for Bible study in Ephesians. If you want to go ahead and at least maybe read a chapter there, and we'll begin our Bible study on Ephesians, and then this Friday right back to devotions. Well, blessings. Bye now.